You probably remember that bizarre headline from a few years back, right? The one about the US wanting to buy Greenland? I mean, it sounded kind of like a joke at the time. But what if it wasn't? What if that single moment actually peeled back the curtain on a hidden playbook for global power? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dive into. We're going to unpack what that strange offer really tells us about the world we live in today. All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with that strange Greenland offer itself. Then we'll poke some holes in the official logic behind it. After that, we get to the really juicy part, this idea of an Orwellian playbook. From there, we'll look at what this all means for allies, the so-called price of protection. And we'll wrap it all up by asking a really big question. Is this just leadership, or is it something closer to an empire? Okay, so let's just rewind for a second and set the scene. The news breaks that the US president at the time was seriously interested in acquiring Greenland, that huge autonomous territory of Denmark. Now, a lot of people just laughed it off, right? But the source material we're digging into today argues that this was one of those moments that was, well, incredibly revealing. And really, it's the specific language that got used here that's the key. This wasn't just some casual, real estate inquiry. According to the source, the discussion involved applying pressure to get it one way or another. And that exact phrasing, that changes everything. It shifts this from a simple business deal to something that sounds a heck of a lot more like coercion. So you gotta ask, right? Why Greenland? What was the interest? Well, the official justification was, as it so often is, all about defense and national security. But here's the thing. The source we're looking at makes a really compelling case that once you start to look a little closer, that entire reasoning, it just completely falls apart. So let's break this down. The official story, the defensive narrative, says the US projects its power to protect allies from threats. Okay, fair enough. But is Greenland a hostile power? Nope. Is it under some kind of imminent threat? Not at all. Is the region unsecured? No way. It's already in the NATO orbit because of Denmark. So you see the problem here. The official story just does not line up with the reality on the ground. Okay, so if it's not really about defense, then what is it about? Well, the source argues the real motivations are all about power and control. It's about getting control of those brand new Arctic shipping routes that are opening up as the ice melts. It's about getting access to Greenland's huge natural resources. And, maybe most importantly, it's about strategic denial, making sure rivals like Russia or China can't get a foothold there. It's all about maintaining that global reach. And this is where things get really interesting. The source we're looking at connects this whole line of thinking directly to George Orwell's famous dystopian novel 1984. The argument is that it's not just a work of fiction, it's practically a playbook for how a superpower can operate in the modern world. So this Oceania thinking, which is what the source calls it, has a few key patterns. First, it just assumes a state of permanent, low-level war. Second, the enemies are basically interchangeable. One day it's Russia, the next is China, but the need for an enemy is always there. Third, geography becomes, well, malleable. Territory isn't seen as a sovereign nation full of people, it's just inventory on a strategic map. And finally, the public justifications can shift all the time, but the real goal never does. It's always about expansion. Now, this is a really important point from the source material. The argument isn't that this was some radical new idea that came out of nowhere. Not at all. It's that this logic was already there, just simmering under the surface, usually hidden behind polite diplomatic language. The big difference here was just a willingness to say the quiet part out loud, to treat another country's sovereignty as something that's openly up for negotiation. And once you open that door, the logic has consequences that stretch way, way beyond the Arctic. I mean, think about it. If you accept the premise that a territory like Greenland can be seen as a necessary acquisition for security reasons, well, that forces you to ask a huge question. Where does that logic ever stop? If it's okay for the Arctic, why not the Antarctic? And that question is the perfect pivot to our second source, which looks at this exact problem, but from the perspective of a key U.S. ally, Australia. The argument here is that this same imperial logic creates a really dangerous dependency, and it could even put Australia's own claims in places like Antarctica at risk. Now, to really get a handle on this dependency, we need to talk about a crucial financial concept, the reserve currency. This isn't just about regular money. We're talking about the one currency, in this case the US dollar, that basically holds up the entire global economy. And as you're about to see, this kind of massive economic power is completely tied at the hip with military power. And this is where you can really see the cycle in action. It works like this. Allies, like Australia, buy U.S. government debt. That money then helps finance the massive U.S. military. In return, that military provides a security umbrella that those same allies come to depend on. And that dependency gets locked in even tighter through things like technology sharing. Think of the AUKUS submarine deal, and the fact that their own economies are so deeply tied to the stability of the U.S. dollar. So, you see, on the surface, it looks like a simple, mutually beneficial security arrangement, but the source frames it in a totally different light. It's described as a coercive system disguised as generosity. In other words, allies are, in effect, helping to fund the very system that guarantees their own dependence on it. It's quite a loop. Which, of course, brings us to the central burning question that both of these sources are really getting at. Where do you draw the line? What's the difference between being a leading global power, a hegemon, and becoming an actual empire? At what point does protection cross a line and become possession? And this comparison here lays out that distinction really clearly. On one side, you have a hegemon. According to the argument, that's a power that leads with some restraint, that acts predictably. But on the other side, you have an empire, maybe one that's in denial. This is a power that sees sovereignty as totally negotiable, views its allies more like assets or inventory, and is driven by a constant need to expand. And the whole Greenland incident, well, it's presented as a textbook example of that second column. And so we come full circle, right back to Orwell. The analysis here is making a really powerful point. 1984 isn't just being used as some clever metaphor. The argument is that the book is a genuine structural warning. It's a warning about what happens to systems of power when they're built on a foundation of permanent, ever-shifting threats. And this really is the chilling conclusion, the ultimate takeaway from the source. This is the engine that drives this entire process. A system that's built on the idea of a permanent threat will eventually need permanent expansion to survive. It has to keep growing its control to manage those threats, whether those threats are real or, manufactured. So we'll end on this final question because it's the one that matters most for allies caught in this system. What is the true cost of all that protection? Is it just about money and political alignment? Or is it something more? Something these sources suggest might be a piece of their own sovereignty? It's a really powerful question and definitely one worth thinking about.